Good afternoon, and thank you for attending the Cannabis Industry Insights and Fireside Chat. My name is Kim Anselmo with Armanino, and I'll be helping drive our webinar technology platform today. So before we get started, I do want to just go through a couple of housekeeping items. First of all, just to let you know, we have our GoToWebinar platform, and you do have the ability to maximize or minimize your webinar pane during the presentation. All you need to do is click on the red orange arrow button. Also, we do want to make sure that you are encouraged to ask questions throughout this presentation. We are going to save some time right at the end to answer those questions the best we can. If we don't get to that question, we'll be sure to follow up with you as well. Please note there is on the webinar pane an area you can enter it into the questions or the chat section. So either one of those will work as well. Next, we do want to make sure that your audio settings are appropriate for today. You have the option to listen either in by phone call or use your computer audio. So if at any time you have any difficulties, please do try switching to the other. And with that, I am going to hand it over to our panelists of the day, Wesley, who will kick us off and get our team introduced as well.
Great. Thank you very much, Kim. We're all going to introduce ourselves. My name is Wesley Hine, and as you can see from the table there, I am with Mammoth Distribution. We are a licensed manufacturer and distributor in California with our brands Heavy Hitters, Almora, and Surplus, among others. We distribute to about 750 retailers in California. And in addition to my work with Mammoth, I'm also on the board of the Cannabis Distributors Association, the Legal Cannabis for Consumer Safety, and I'm also very active in the California Cannabis Industry Association, and all of those groups are looking at interstate trade. Mike?
Hello, I'm Mike Garrell. I'm the national tax partner in charge of our cannabis practice for Armanino. Armanino is a national accounting firm, and we provide all the same services to the cannabis industry that we provide to other industry groups, including bookkeeping, tax, audit, and consulting services. I was nominated by the California Cannabis Association for CPA of the Year, Cannabis CPA of the Year, and I wrote a treatise for Thomson Reuters on multi-state cannabis taxation that goes through all the different states and how they tax this industry on a state-by-state basis. Mark?
Hi, I'm Mark Hauser. I'm an attorney with Reed Smith, a 1,600-ish lawyer global law firm with offices everywhere, just about. I've been a deal and capital markets lawyer for over 20 years and have spent the past 3 or 4 years now almost working exclusively in cannabis. And I'm excited, and there's nothing gives me more excitement than to talk about constitutional issues relating to cannabis. And one thing I should just preface is that as a lawyer is that none of this is legal advice. I always have to say. Sorry, Jennifer.
All right. Hello, thank you for having me. I'm Jennifer Cabrera. I am counsel with Vicente Cederberg's New York and New Jersey offices. Vicente Cederberg is a kind of unique firm, much smaller than Reed Smith. We're about 40 lawyers, and we focus exclusively on the cannabis and hemp industries. Founded in Denver in 2010, the offices in LA, Boston, and now New York and New Jersey. My previous life was as a commercial litigator, and since 2019 I've been full-time doing regulatory compliance and licensing for the tri-state area.
Fantastic. So these are some of the topics that we're going to cover. I won't read them because other people can see them, but I just want to sort of open up with why we're talking about interstate trade. It's stating the obvious that companies should have strategies. But to form a strategy, you need to know, or at least have a hypothesis where your industry is going. And for the cannabis industry, there's almost no larger elephant in the room than legalization, and something maybe no more impactful than interstate trade. And so why don't other industries talk about interstate trade? Because essentially it's a given. If you think about every other good you're able to make those and ship those across state lines with certain very limited restrictions. And in fact, let's just think about the typical sort of kitchen table. You might have beef that came from Texas, syrup from Vermont, produce from California, juice from Florida. Meanwhile, on the TV was a movie made in Hollywood, music that was recorded in Nashville and so forth. And none of those were limited to the states that they were manufactured or produced. So cannabis is, we know, is heavily restricted, and you may not do that. If you are a consumer of cannabis in Alaska, you can have any cannabis you want as long as it was grown and those products were made in Alaska. Similarly, if you're a producer in Maine, you may sell to anyone you want as long as that person happens to be an adult who resides in Maine. And so these restrictions are very much the result and just artifacts of prohibition. And the question will be, as legalization comes, and we'll talk about that, what will happen to these restrictions? And is one other thing worth noting, there already is a multi-billion-dollar trade, I hate to break it to policymakers, in cannabis. California cannabis is found all over the country, as is from other states. It just happens to be totally unregulated, untested, and untaxed. And so certainly coming up with sensible regulations makes sense. But I'm putting a little bit of the cart before the horse. Let's talk about legalization. And in fact, if the panel is able to answer this one quickly, we can all go home now early, just by telling us, when will cannabis be federally legalized and how specifically will that happen? I know all of you have opinions on it.
Well, I'll start off real quick. I think that, there were many of us that were thinking that having the, White House be controlled by the Democrats would be a really changing moment in this industry group and how quickly legalization would come about. But I was really disappointed to hear recently where the White House fired a number of staff people because of their prior cannabis use, and not even like, okay, this was like they were caught in the White House smoking, something or whatever. This is like events that took place a while back. And so I think that, Kamala Harris and others that were, running a campaign about, hey, how we're going to help this industry, I feel very disappointed that these actions were taken, and it just doesn't lend itself to legalization anytime soon, at least from the White House.
Mark, do you agree?
I mean, I think that what happened, what the incident you're talking about, I think belies the political reality of getting anything done in Congress and in the federal government. I think that everybody in this industry is expected that the federal government, banking was just around the corner. I mean, how many years have we heard that the Safe Banking Act was going to pass this year? And I think something still happens next year, but I think that I think all of this, politics are really hard. And yeah, I mean, I agree, it's disappointing, but at the same time, federal law is federal law. And, and I think I don't know enough about the way those rules work to know whether the White House had discretion to waive those rules. I don't know. As disappointing as it is, and so I think that
on the spot.
Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's my brother's birthday today, and I promised him he would have an answer when legalization is happening. So I'm going to put you on the spot. We know it's hard. When does it happen? How does it happen, in your opinion?
If it happens, it either happens by next summer, or after the next election if the Democrats take the White House again.
And Jen, you were in the hotbed of legalization discussion at the state level between what's happened in New Jersey already and might happen in New York. I guess it depends how many more sexual harassment cases come out between now and the potential of legalization. But I mean, can you just sort of share your opinion both on the local level and how that might portend to the national level, and what your opinion or Vincente's opinion is on national legalization?
Well, I think that there's some in my firm who are much more optimistic about this than I am. I tend to be a pessimist by nature, risk-averse pessimist. And I'm not a gambling woman either. So I wouldn't put it before the next election. And I almost think that at the national level, our politics are so broken that maybe we'd have a better chance of it if Republicans were in charge, honestly, because they're not going to go along with anything the Democrats suggest. At the local level, very different. I think that it's been challenging for a lot of the East Coast states to legalize legislatively because there's a massive cannabis market that exists here right now. New York City is the largest cannabis consumer in the world, and it's all black market for the most part. So it's challenging to regulate that and just change the rules effectively.
Yeah, then I will be the lone optimist on this group. And I don't think you can keep a plant that's as amazing as cannabis down forever. And I think it's inevitable. I believe it'll happen sooner rather than later, because at some point or another, 50 states will have legalized it. Over 2/3 of Americans are supportive of it. I just can't see, as hard as things are. But maybe now we'll put the optimism aside. Let's talk about the last time at least something similar to cannabis, because we know industrial hemp really is the same thing. It just happens to have been bred for low for THC. That was legalized. I'll do the air quotes because I'm sure we're all going to talk about the problems with it. But mostly, what lessons, let's say legalization happens, because I believe it will. What lessons can be garnered from what happened with industrial hemp that we might see with cannabis, including who's going to regulate? Who wants to take that one?
I'll start that one off and then let smarter people talk. I would say that it was a disaster the way the 2018 Farm Bill was rolled out. It's almost harder for a company to operate compliantly in the hemp space than it is for them to operate in the cannabis space if they're in a legal market. And that's just simply because the FDA has not really waded in and made it possible to operate as a commercial product that isn't a pharmaceutical. So I would hope that the lessons that are drawn are that something like the MORE Act or the States Act don't go far enough, that the federal government actually does need to wade into the issue of interstate commerce, because you have these state programs that have been built up, and if the federal government throws a bomb in there and says, now it's all legal, I think that's challenging.
Yeah. I'd agree with that. I think I agree with everything you're saying. If we see legalization, I think that you will see something that is much more fulsome and thought out, so that the rules are more set on day one. I mean, you had the USDA didn't put out regulation for 9 months on licensing state programs. I think that there are too many interests involved who are going to help write this law over the next 12 months, or at least try to write it. And that's not, it's both within the federal government, the DEA or the ATF. The ATF currently regulates alcohol and tobacco, so cannabis sort of is a logical step there. But also, business interests are going to be lobbying on this stuff. I think that they're going to want to make sure that that when on the day legalization occurs, everybody can hit the ground running, and everybody generally knows what the rules are.
And that rarely happens in government, where we'll set the rules ahead of time, because most of the time, it's going to be delay after delay, and I just see that it's going to be the same, fiasco that we had with the Farm Bill, because even with banking, we've seen where it's federally legal, interstate commerce, all these things that we should see in other industry groups finally came to the hemp industry. Yet if they went into a commercial bank, they would still have trouble getting a bank account open, and there's just still hesitancy there. And so I think that, it's going to be quite a Herculean effort to try to get this industry, nationally legal. And then if it is nationally legal, to get all the states to agree under some sort of federal guideline that they'll all, fall under and administer.
All right, well, I'm going to continue to go back and be the positive voice, because none of the states, the federal government, nobody wanted to legalize cannabis in the first place, and you just cannot keep a good plant down. And I believe that there's more winners than losers. And let's put the legalities aside for a second, because I think that, maybe some of you were wondering why I called you up and said, we need to talk about interstate trade. Why are you so excited about it? It seems so far away. What's the big deal? And I'm passionate about it because I think it's so good. But I understand that there's going to be two sides to everything. What do people think are going to be would be the winners and the losers in a market that cannabis was treated like other goods, in the sense it wasn't stopped at the state border?
Well, I think that, when we make an analogy to like alcohol, no one runs around the corner to find illegal alcohol somewhere. It's just common that you would go to some sort of authorized, facility to buy your alcohol. And I would wish the same thing would happen with cannabis, where there is no stigma attached to it. It's just like going in and buying, a 6-pack of beer that, hey, if that's what I want to buy, I want to be able to buy it. And I want to be able to have freedom of choice to be able to buy like the good stuff, if you will, from wherever it's sourced, not necessarily my home state.
Yeah, I mean, I think that dovetailing, I think in the long run, everybody wins. I mean, that's sort of trite, but I think, I think many of the problems that cannabis deals with day to day will go away over time. There's going to be, but I mean, as we just talked about, I mean, I think in the short run, after all of this, it's going to be very messy, and there will be some losers. But I think that in the long run, I think everybody will benefit, because then you'll have a true, you'll have a true marketplace that works like a market should.
I think that in the short term, after legalization, there will definitely be winners and losers. And I think that there are so many valid opinions on this issue, because you have companies that have made massive infrastructure investments in a state, operating according to that state's rules and making sure that they're fully vertical in that state. That goes away. Like, I live in New Jersey. It's not geographically very large. Like, there's no reason why it should be growing all of the cannabis that's consumed in the state, but there are companies that are putting a lot of money into building up that capability. So if the legalization came about in 2 years, that would be lost if there weren't a protected transition phase. And I think there's a appreciation, I think, at the federal level, that a transition stage would be necessary. On the other hand, though, I mean, product companies would do incredibly well to open up interstate transport. Like, we have no brands on the East Coast outside of Massachusetts. It just doesn't exist. So being able to get brands from some established markets would be huge. The country would open up to them.
Look, I agree with both of you, and I'm more on the side that almost everybody wins. I think the illicit market loses because they no longer have a de facto exclusive, but the winners would be consumers. It's not just the choice, but innovation. Because for a lot of things, I mean, you think, again, other goods, if you're limited to only selling in your state, it's hard to invest in doing all of the things that you might need to do, as opposed to having a national market. I think retailers, this is a big win. If you're a single shop and you're surrounded by chain stores, any other business, you'd go, well, I'll come up with a unique selection. That's how I'll compete. But you can't do that in this sort of regimented way. You're limited to the same products, more or less, that everybody else has. And I think distributors, because most likely, I don't mean to jump ahead, but I think that, certainly one path by which we will see interstate trade happen is that producers will sell to distributors in their local, the distributor will sell to a distributor in another state that will handle whatever tax collection, whatever compliance issues, because we know those won't go away, whatever testing that's required, and so forth. So I think it just opens up more choice. And then also want to bring up the environment wins. Because right now, I think that people, it was put on, it sort of, I think with COVID, it was the environment, I think people put aside just for a year or so because so many other things, but we're going to come back and then look at the environmental impact and the footprint of national indoor grows. Now, I think from a boutique and connoisseur point of view, we will always have indoor, but I think it's crazy that states would be required, large swaths of the United States, to grow things indoors any more than, requiring almonds to be grown indoors or oranges or any other thing. All right, so you might have mentioned it, Mark, but I think that one thing that is key is there are bits of legislation, I shouldn't call it bits, is legislation for legalizing cannabis. The MORE Act and the States Act. How is interstate trade covered in those, if at all? And if it's not covered, what does that mean for the ability for producers to be able to ship across state lines?
If I remember correctly, and I would ask my panelists to correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think they say anything about interstate trade. And I don't, I don't know. I don't know that they necessarily even need to, because the way the Constitution, the Commerce Clause, and the Dormant Commerce Clause that I guess we can get into deal with the issue. States generally are not allowed to burden interstate commerce, and so, but I think it would, if a court were looking at it, I think a statement from Congress would go a long way. But I don't think the current drafts of the bills say anything, but I could be wrong about that.
I believe you're correct. Yeah, that it doesn't say anything about interstate commerce. It's very, broad, in its language, and in talking about, making it, legal, taking away 280E as a, limitation that cannabis companies face. And so I don't think it's been addressed.
So I think that's, go ahead. I think that's a really interesting point, which is if passed largely in the versions they are, then Mark, I can't remember if you used the word shaky ground, but the state prohibitions on the ability to bring cannabis in or take cannabis out would be very much subject to, I guess, challenge in the courts.
Yes. I think that's right. Jennifer, you were going to say something about this, or I don't want to.
Yeah, so I think that it's true that the MORE and States Acts don't say anything about interstate commerce. So their passage would result in interstate commerce of cannabis being legal. However, then I think, would states be able to ban cannabis? I think possibly, yes, if they have a reason for it. But I also think that if the federal government were to just remove this barrier, it would really just create incredible disruption for all of the state programs to have no guided transition phase.
Sounds
That's
like
why they have to have something in there.
I was going to say, it's a lot of work for attorneys, no matter what happens.
We're a guild.
So
well, it kind of brings us back to the Farm Bill, where it became federally legal, and then it created more chaos. And it was much easier for me to work with cannabis companies because at least I knew what the rules were going to be in any given state. But when you talk about hemp, it was like, well, we don't really know. And then the federal government hasn't acted, and when they did act, the regs, were helpful, certainly, but they weren't all encompassing, and states still had issues and conflicts to decide, should we make our rules more restrictive than the federal rules, or should we have our rules be more lax than the federal rules, and is that allowed under the statute, the federal statute?
That's a good point. And Jen, you also mentioned something. You said if there was a reason, right? You know, if they were to decide to a state, well, let's assume legalization. Let's assume that it written into the legalization is not a prohibition. So the states, some of them will go, well, I'll just keep doing, since every state that I know of has written in prohibitions, and we'll talk about Oregon in a second. So they might continue, but what reasons would there be to want to have discriminatory practices against out-of-state cannabis?
I don't think you could have a discriminatory policy saying that I'm going to tax out-of-state products higher than in-state. That would be banned by the Dormant Commerce Clause. But could a state have an absolute ban on the products? I think both the MORE and the state tax allow that, much like how Idaho says no hemp here. That something like that would be allowed for cannabis.
Yeah, I agree with that take. I think that both things could exist at the same time, where the federal government could say, the states could decide whether or not to allow for cannabis, but then the courts could say, if you allow for cannabis, you can't, you have to allow for commerce.
And since we're down to, is it 3 states? How many states do not allow any form of cannabis, even medicinal?
I think there's like about 6.
Okay, and so that's quickly dwindling. But no, I believe what you've said makes sense. So if some state goes against the will of all possible reason, they would be able to do that. But in Jen, I know you're in the thick of it with New York. I think that's the 3rd most populous state. And then when you add in tourism and everything else, just the impact of that, has interstate come up at all? And because there was some talk of a I don't know if it was the words trade block, but somehow synchronizing. I don't know if it was limited to tax rates or other regulations between the states.
Yes, I know that the regulators of the Northeast definitely were communicating to coordinate on tax rates, to coordinate on testing, on a number of regulatory issues. As far as trading blocks, I don't know how seriously that's being discussed by regulators, because it is a bit farther off down the road. However, if something like the MORE, the States Act were to pass, you could actually have these regional compacts effectively that do allow. Honestly, I'm not really sure how it would work, but you would have to have a situation where you could have like sort of easier movement between just a limited number of states that doesn't run into the Dormant Commerce Clause, and I'm not really sure that would work with either the MORE or the States Act, frankly.
Well, and then there's some precedent under the multi-state tax compact that was back in the 60s, and this involved sales taxes and trying to get uniform laws and regs around sales taxes so that you could facilitate interstate commerce and you wouldn't have this huge discrepancy of tax between commerce going from one state through another state to get to a 3rd state. And so those compacts those cases went up to the US Supreme Court. They were upheld by the US Supreme Court. So there is a precedent for states to band together as a group to have common rules and regs so that, at least from a tax perspective, will make and facilitate interstate commerce, not hinder it, and not create any sort of incentive for someone to go over a bridge to get their cannabis product at a lower tax rate and bring it across the bridge into another jurisdiction where it has a higher tax rate, and eliminate that whole issue.
Yeah, go ahead, Mark.
And I don't see any reason why you couldn't, in theory, have that today. I mean, it's illegal anyway. So, I think for policy reasons, the states are why the states are a little more hesitant to allow it. I think it's more an optics issue, but I mean, I don't see I don't see any reason why states couldn't allow interstate commerce if they wanted to today. Similarly, I mean, somebody could go to court and start challenging this stuff now. Nobody has, but you could. And you would have I think you'd still have the same good arguments that these laws all burden interstate commerce are unconstitutional. The policy argument is probably a little harder because it's still federally legal.
Well, and I think, Mark, we were talking earlier about how some of these residency requirements of states, in order to obtain a license, to my knowledge, they've all been in favor of the taxpayer, not the challenger plaintiff, and against the state for having those kinds of rules. So I think there is some groundwork being laid to allow interstate commerce, and that may be the first step towards that.
So Jen, you've probably had to explain the Cole memorandum to your client since it was written. So do you feel, building on just what was said, do you feel that the Cole memorandum explicitly addresses the trade between two states where it has been made state legal?
That's a hard one to answer.
I'm only going to give you hard questions.
I think that it's debatable, and I'm a bit on the fence personally. Like, I think it really comes down to risk tolerance there, but I would think that the CSA as drafted, there is an argument that that would qualify as interstate commerce in violation of what the memorandum is advising. Mark, what do you think?
I'd agree with you. I think I think though I would say that, and I mean a little sort of the point I guess I was trying to inarticulately make earlier was that it's illegal if it's within the state. So bringing it across state lines, I don't know that there's much difference. But I agree with you, Jennifer, that I don't know that the principles of the Cole memo really changed much of anything with respect to whether or not interstate commerce would be different.
So it is, because that's certainly one of the things that people, as I've talked about this topic, they go, boy, the Cole memo says, to other states, but it is silent as whether those other states are like Idaho or Nevada. And there's certainly a very, very big difference.
Well, it's also moot because the Cole memo was rescinded anyway, but under Sessions.
All right, you're going to bring that technicality out on me. Thank you. So you all have clients. Have people asked you about this? Is this something, meaning interstate? Is this something on their radar, or are just the day-to-day demands of existing in the cannabis industry so much that this just seems years and years off? Jen, as you mentioned, there's a lot of people who will have white elephants if this happens, with the big investments they've made. It strikes me as they might want to be asking you, hey, if this happens in the next 3 years, I might want to be amortizing everything I do over the next 3 years. They are anyways.
True. I would say that the biggest issue facing our clients is 280E. Like, it's honestly just the fact that it's so hard to make money in this industry. They almost want the certainty of the current legal framework to remain the same if they could just eliminate that burden. Honestly, a big federal change would would be quite a disruption if it were done in an elegant way.
Well, I don't think
what I'm seeing is that, the large MSOs are certainly looking to expand their brand into all of these new jurisdictions and try to dominate and grab market share, especially in the new markets, before other brands can establish themselves. And the smaller entities, unfortunately, their exit strategy is 3 years, maybe 4 at tops, And so whether it becomes interstate, commerce and legal across the country or not, they're going to sell out to the highest bidder in 3 years. And so they're expanding as quickly as they can so they can get the biggest valuation they can so they can sell for the largest amount of money that they can. And they're not looking to build a legacy company for 10, 20, 30 years, well beyond whenever it becomes, legal across the country.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think that I think it's not just the MSOs, but I think you'll see quickly. I think you will see the large multinational CPG companies and alcohol and tobacco companies that are going to swoop in after legalization to make a presence in this industry, as well as the alcohol distribution companies that are going to want to help with distribution, who are already starting to, look at the coalition that was formed a week and a half ago that just came out, that was made up of a lot of large multinational companies, but no cannabis companies. And I think that, they will want interstate commerce because that's the model. And so, yeah, I mean, Jennifer, I agree. I think that, the folks that are in limited license states are going to, the value of that license is going to diminish very quickly. When you don't, the retail, I still think the retail dispensaries may still be limited, but the folks that are focused on cultivation and manufacturing and wholesale distribution, they're the ones who are going to lose their value.
Well, the lucky ones who were able to get licenses, because I mean, in Florida, what is there, 11 operators right now up? So like, because I think one of the fears is by a lot of people are like, oh my God, industry consolidation is going to hurt things. And yet for, many of these states, there is really effectively no way for entrepreneurs to even enter in the market. And so I think that there's actually a lot of reason for optimism that we're at the most restrictive, the most consolidated that we will ever be. And while it changes and new things will come in, I think there's going to be a lot of opportunities for people. I mean, it's interesting when industries grow, it's always the middle that becomes sort of the no man's land, so to speak. If you're small boutique and make quality products, you can do very well, whether that is cannabis or movies or entertainment or anything else. And if you're large, but if you're in that middle without the scale and without the uniqueness, it can be very difficult. But part of me I don't see this dystopian future where somebody's got a good idea for a cannabis product or they've got a great strain or something, that actually the opportunities for them won't get better. They might not be able to go public with a SPAC in Canada and be worth $1 billion before they've done anything. But I do feel like I'm hoping we're at the most restrictive we've ever been, we're at the most taxed we've ever been, and everything else.
And I really do agree with you in a lot of ways with that on that, Wesley. I would say that long term, that's definitely where we're going. It's in everybody's interest to open the market. Like the fact is that for alcohol, not all beer that's consumed in New York is brewed in New York. Like you want to be able to get beer from other states. And you can have craft breweries. Like there's still a desire for quality and like for micro business. But I think that just the transition, because it's been set up in this completely backwards way by doing it 50 different systems or up to 50 different systems, that the transition needs to be thoughtful. And it's not just honestly like the infrastructure investments of large companies, it's also those equity applicants. And a lot of the East Coast states have large social equity programs, and it's not clear that they're going to have this, the value of their license really is diminished if there is just this immediate transition before they can build up.
Yeah, that's an interesting, that raises an interesting point is, the dormant commerce clause is not, I don't remember what level of scrutiny it gets, but it's not absolute. I'm having flashbacks to constitutional law in first year of law school, but there are exceptions to it, like public safety, but public safety has been very narrowly interpreted. But whether an argument could be made that that social equity is a policy reason to allow for certain types of restraints on commerce. I mean, but you know, it would be hard to argue, you know, a large company needing it for social equity, but a small social equity, I don't know. I mean, maybe there's something to fit in there from a policy
Well,
perspective that works out. I don't know.
and that brings an interesting position because you could have social equity versus discrimination, you know, as a case, because someone could argue that providing all of this, you know, social equity provisions and allowing them to be able to get licensed discriminates against other people that would otherwise qualify to get licenses. And I think that would make an interesting case because normally you don't see, you know, two areas battling it out against one another in that way.
Well, so yeah, I think it certainly has to be part of the conversation. I'll tell you, in Los Angeles, at least looking through the lens here, the social equity applicants have just gotten crushed by the bureaucratic morass, by the inability to have regulations that allow them to operate. So they were given, you know, oh, here's your ability to get a license, but they were not given the ability to be able to operate, you know, a business on any economic level. And then because of many of the prohibitions that exist, raising capital has all been impossible and some of the other things. So yeah,
Well,
I
and
hope
then
it's
you
part.
add to, well, you add to that those social equity license holders in Los Angeles spent 3 years paying rent for facilities they couldn't operate and use. I mean, it was just done very badly, I think, and it was just not fair to them.
Right, the social equity applicant that we sponsor as part of our licensing, the products they make would sell all over the country. You know, they have a brand that people are aware. And the unfortunate thing for them, like all producers, but certainly the boutique ones, is the only way for them to get their brand to other states is to go through very costly, you know, licensing agreements. And that's not easy for small, you know, for small groups to do. So I sort of keep circling back that the regulations and the taxes and the restrictions are the things that are doing more harm to small operators than anything else that's going on. And that consolidation will happen, but like I said, if they have the ability to uniquely position themselves and they're not prohibited from positioning themselves in a unique way and bringing in products, that's the best thing that can, you know, happen. I want to just throw one thing out because I was looking at the rules. You're probably all familiar, you know, Canada's legalized, but the provinces handle it in different ways. And I can't remember which province it is, but the only way for consumers, they can't go into a dispensary, buy something, or a retailer buy something and then go home. It has to go through the post. And so that brings up a direct to consumer. Since we're talking about legalization and multi-state, is there ever a scenario, and Mike, it was noted, I think you brought up about the long-term regulations and challenges with alcohol, but finally, at least it seems like you can order alcohol through the mail, with at least where we are. Do we ever think direct to consumer is going to happen?
I say no. I don't think, I mean, you can't buy cigarettes through the mail. So, and, I mean, and there's a law, and they just expanded the law to now say that it's not just cigarettes, it's all tobacco vaping products. So you know, I don't think so. I think, you know, it's such a hot button issue to be. Cannabis is so politically charged and policy charged anyway that, you know, I don't, you know, the ability to buy it outside of a licensed establishment, you know, anytime soon is just, you know, beyond my comprehension. I don't know.
And I think those are just like artificial barriers that we've been talking about, is that, you know, you can buy alcohol through the mail now, but you can't buy tobacco, but you can get prescription drugs now by the mail, you know. And so it's all a matter of the lobbying group and how how effective are they in getting something like, you know, cannabis through the mail. You know, that's the final, you know, I guess, frontier in this industry. Is once we have interstate commerce, then we remove the barriers within these states. then we can have products that are coming in from other states. What about other countries? And then finally, we may get to, direct mail purchases available. I just think that's going to be the final one.
Yeah, I hope one day it's from a licensed retailer. Right now somebody can get on a motorcycle and drive, or maybe not a motorcycle, but their compliant vehicle, and to drive it to a consumer. Why not a common carrier if somebody has to show an ID and all these other things like that? And I'm not expecting it tomorrow, but I just continue to come back and go, the vast majority of Americans feel that there's nothing wrong with medicinal marijuana. The vast majority of Americans believe in legalization. This might take another generation or two, but I just feel that we deal with so much of the vestiges of prohibition, and I don't see why we shouldn't be able to have, still with whatever requirements need to be there. So, one other thing, and this was one of the questions that somebody posed me, and they go, I hope you'll address how you'll handle taxes and track and trace and testing and so forth. So I'll throw this out to the panel. Let's say we start to have interstate trade. What are the issues that will have to be figured out, and how will they figure those out?
Well, I think from a taxation standpoint, you're going to go back to the alcohol model. And, those alcohol distributors have bonded warehouses, they have secure facilities, they have the infrastructure in place to be able to, figure out, if the product's starting in California, it's going to end in New York, which taxes are going to apply. Is it, California for the cultivation tax, for instance, and then maybe New York at the final retail sale, there'll be some sort of an excise, sales tax, imposed on that product. They would be the most logical way of being able to, effectuate that transaction.
So it's taxes.
Well, I think that states will be able to set like testing standards, quality standards. Like there are no problems with requiring any product that's sold in New York to be grown free of pesticides and so forth. So I think that a lot of the sort of interstate coordination that we're seeing now is on that level, really. And we'll probably see more of that. But even once there is interstate transport, like that is a way that states can sort of limit what products come in and make sure that they're the quality they expect.
I think that's exactly right. Everything you list that's being handled on an intrastate level, it's not insurmountable to deal on an interstate level. And so, when they're like, how do you handle track and trace? Answer, honestly, pretty easily. I mean, notwithstanding to the complete ineptitude of the existing providers in track and trace. But the fact is you can have a manifest that shows it's going from one licensed distributor to another distributor. And even if that's distributor in another state, it creates a very easy audit trail. You're absolutely right, I feel, on testing. And, I'll say this about, well, one of the things I laugh about is the symbol. So we put a symbol on all cannabis products. I think every state requires it. Maybe there's one that doesn't, but I don't know of one that doesn't, to quote unquote warn people of that this is this dangerous product, even though it's not. But they put it on there, and every state has its own symbol, and then they're generally called universal symbols, which is a little ironic for that. But one thing you would start coming down and you go, when COVID passes, which it's starting to, we will see people traveling again. And why should somebody who is in Connecticut, who drives into New York to go to work, all of a sudden going to have to say, oh, here's the symbol, I don't know what this is. Then when they're on vacation in Hawaii or Las Vegas, to be seeing different symbols. So certainly some of the things, and this one would hope the industry does, is then start advocating and saying, if we're going to have a universal symbol, let's have a universal symbol. Let's have a symbol that says there's THC in here, and then not have people have to guess what they are. And so I feel like the roadblocks that people put up on them are so small in comparison to what we've had to do, intrastate, that it's really just a lack of imagination. So one thing I should have mentioned is that people can ask questions. And so if anybody who's watching would like to go ahead and send some questions, we've had a few come in, but want to make sure we encourage other people to do that. And before we start running down, we've got a few minutes left. We'll answer any questions that come in, but I really want to just sort of open up to the panel. You've had a chance to listen to my sort of blathering questions. When you think about this topic and when you're talking with your clients and those things, just what do you feel? How do you, I know we opened up with our predictions, but what are some of the other things that you'd just like to share about interstate trade and legalization in general?
Well, I would say that, this pandemic has really opened up the market. Cannabis companies were deemed essential businesses, I think, in virtually all the states where it was legal. And that certainly helped the industry when they were going through a tough time. Valuations were going down. Many of them were struggling, but this was a big boom for the industry. And it created an awareness that, cannabis is not just a product to get high, that many people relied on cannabis as a, coping mechanism with depression and other issues that they may have faced during this pandemic. And I think it allowed people to see, a different side of cannabis rather than just, hey, we're going to get, high and on a doobie. And I think it was beneficial to the industry. And I think another factor is going to be, tax revenue. New York and other states have made it very clear that COVID created budget shortfalls that by legalizing cannabis could help alleviate some of those issues and problems that they face on a budgetary standpoint. And so that's going to encourage, I think, other states to do the same because, this is a great way to raise revenue without raising personal income taxes, property taxes, and other types of taxes that may still go up because of the shortfalls that the states face. But at least this is one way of offsetting some of that, and that may help, promote more interstate commerce because of the fact that more states are going to be looking for revenue to make up because of COVID.
Well, anytime somebody says, well, go ahead, Mark.
Oh, no. Okay.
I was going to say, anytime somebody says taxes, I can't shut up, as probably the three of you know, and everybody else who knows me. Cannabis is the most overly taxed, and I understand that's an opinion, but I think it's fact, commodity probably on the planet. By my calculations, it's 114 times wine, it's 78 times beer, and there's just no conceivable reason why you'd have that. And the problem has been that what are you going to do if you want to make a cannabis product and then you are subjected to whatever taxes there are in your local jurisdiction, your state, and so forth. There is effectively very little in the way of competition. On a local level, if you're a distributor, you get to pick the jurisdiction you want to be in, but not if you're a retailer. But with the states coming, and then the ability, I mean, you think about, Elon Musk with his Gigafactory. He looked around and said, I will place it in Texas because of the taxes they had there. We start to have a little bit of competition. Could we see something where a Curaleaf or any producer looks down and says, hey, I get to now shop for jurisdictions where I want to go ahead and do my cultivation or my manufacture or some of these things like that. And really, in some ways, how beneficial that might be in rectifying the taxation because I think a lot of people, and I understand it, they accepted these very high taxes because the alternative was total prohibition. And so did sort of a deal with the devil, so to speak, to accept it. But what we've seen is the flip side of that is these taxes are so incredibly high that the traditional market has such a significant cost advantage that it hasn't really accomplished. I think legalization of these states hasn't accomplished the goals and the promise of it. Maybe that was a better thing. And I'm having trouble seeing questions. So Kim, if you're still there, if you would like to maybe share some of the questions with us as
You
before,
bet.
right?
Yeah, sure. So a question from the audience. How do you think interstate commerce will affect retail cannabis? Oh, sorry, cannabis store rules in local jurisdictions. So how do you think interstate commerce will affect retail store cannabis rules in local jurisdictions?
In so many ways we can't even comprehend.
Can you elaborate?
Oh dear. And it affects the price. If you have free, like actual interstate commerce of cannabis and free trade, like what Wesley's talking about, then you don't have the costs of having this many cultivation facilities. You can have like most of the cannabis in the country grown on the West Coast outdoors. Or like you can have some like a couple large facilities like in a region serving the entire region. That really does bring down costs. I think that like you also would have more brands. It would be like going into a Target or more akin to that. But I also think that those changes are farther off than we would like because of the way the market has been set up. It's an accident that it was set up this way with these different state systems, but that's where we are. And I think that like, so recently Senator Wyden said at a fundraiser, basically that the federal government is going to have to be very thoughtful at making a transition from these state systems to a federal system. And it's not only all the investments that have been put in, but the equity applicants that exist in those systems. So I think that no matter what, we're going to see a slower transition. And I think that at the federal level, a lot of people do recognize that.
Great.
Well, and you know, one other thing that we haven't really talked about is that by having each state with its own rules, it employs a number of people to help administer all those rules. And, you know, just in California, you know, Wes, how many people do we have probably working in the cannabis industry statewide and at the local government level that are administrating all these license applications and dealing with, you know, environmental issues and all of the different aspects where all these different agencies are involved? You know, if you came up with a national system that took away all of that, it would have a percentage impact on state government employment.
Yeah, but I mean, but to be fair, I mean, it maybe it'll go down, but this is, you know, there's still going to be plenty of regulation to go around. There's still going to be, you know, I mean, I suspect you know, if you look at alcohol, you have to have both a federal and a state license to produce. So, you know, I mean, and there's still, you know, you still are going to have, I would imagine, quite a bit of compliance requirements, testing. I mean, do we see any of that changing? You know, I don't know. I guess I don't see legalization resulting in deregulation. I think it ends up being more, it may in the long run be more sensible and predictable regulation. But I personally don't think it's gonna be less. But
I agree with you completely. I mean, look, at regulators love to regulate. The thing I like that I think there's just no, because the dormant comment clause does not say that there can't be silly regulations and burdensome regulations. What they say is it can't just be discriminatory. So I do feel that there'll be still full employment for the people that want to make this a difficult industry. But I'm just hoping that the retailers in California can carry products from, you know, Oklahoma and vice versa.
Great. We do have another question. Assuming some form of federal legalization in the future, do you see cannabis being subject to FDA deeming regulation like tobacco is currently?
I mean, I guess it depends on what the feds decide which department gets to regulate it.
Well, what are the choices, Mark? How many groups could try to take claim?
I don't know. I mean, practically, I mean, you probably would have, I would guess you probably have alcohol, tobacco, firearms as the main licensing arm. You know, the FDA would probably have something to say about it. And certainly, you know, still go on a medical claims or anything like that. I'm sure the DEA will have something to do with it. You know, I mean, to me, those seem like the main agencies that would, but you know, but again, hopefully a lot of that'll be flushed out into,
How about
you know,
USDA? Do we have to bone up on those regs?
I mean, maybe for cultivation.
Well, yeah, because to be certified organic and all of that, I would imagine so, yeah. And I think you'll end up having the same, you know, regulatory bodies that we see in California be at the federal level too, because everybody's going to see this as a great windfall for their agency to now to have some sort of, you know, interest to say that, hey, we need to have a say at the table at these regs.
So one, I want to thank everybody. We're at the top of the hour, but one thing I learned in very much in detail is there's going to be no shortage of work for cannabis attorneys for a very long time, no matter what happens. But I do believe that it's kind of amazing, honestly, that we're here talking about cannabis and how much has changed in a relatively short time. And so, I mean, many members of my family work in the cannabis industry. I mean, it's incredible. So the argument, I think, against how slowly government works is in some ways how quickly at least the societal change has happened. So I do want to end on kind of an optimistic note because I think we all believe in the industry, and certainly we all understand that there's going to be a lot of challenges and so forth, but I think it's up and away. So if any final comments from our panelists? Otherwise, I super appreciate your time.
Thanks for having us. This
Yeah.
was great.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Russ.
Anything that we didn't answer, we'll try to get to those. And I think, Kim, can you share if people want to watch or share the recording?
Yes, so just for everybody on the call, the recording will be shared in the next 72 business hours. And if you do have any questions for our panelists here, their information will be shared with you as well. Thank you, everybody, for attending.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks a
Thank
lot.
you.